The hall was alive with soft chatter and the delicate clinking of glasses. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their crystals catching the light and scattering it across the marble floor. People moved gracefully between tables, holding plates of appetizers and flutes of sparkling wine, exchanging polite greetings and soft laughter. It was one of those events where everything seemed perfectly arranged: flowers and vases, elegant tablecloths, and a sense of quiet sophistication floating in the air. But despite all the glamour, there was a certain tension under the surface. Some of the guests were here to show off, to be seen, to bask in the admiration of others. Others, like her, had simply been invited, quietly stepping into a world that was unfamiliar and slightly intimidating. She had arrived early, not because she was eager to be noticed, but because she had been curious. She had always loved music, though she had never played in public before. The invitation had come unexpectedly, a polite note tucked into her mailbox with no explanation other than that her presence would be appreciated. She didn't know anyone at the event, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Being surrounded by strangers allowed her to observe without pressure, to move quietly in the shadows while the world celebrated itself around her. The piano sat at one end of the hall, a gleaming black grand with polished keys that seemed to invite attention. Its presence was almost magnetic, drawing people closer with the promise of music. Some guests had lingered near it earlier, testing a few notes with hesitant fingers, just to see how it felt. They were all amateurs, unsure of their own skills, and their attempts were met with polite smiles and gentle claps. She had noticed them as she walked past, but she didn't linger. Music had always been something personal to her. It wasn't for showing off or competing. It was for the quiet moments that existed only between her and the notes. Then he arrived. He was impossible to miss, even from across the room. The famous pianist had a presence that filled the space before he even played a single note. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime on stage, who knew exactly how to hold an audience in his hands. His smile was charming but calculated, the kind that made people admire him and feel slightly smaller at the same time. When he approached the piano, the room seemed to lean forward, as if the furniture itself wanted to witness what would happen next. She watched him from a distance, curiosity flickering in her chest. She had heard of him, of course, as everyone had. His performances were legendary, stories of his talent reaching far beyond the world of professional music, into everyday conversation. But now, seeing him in person, something about him felt different. Not unkind, exactly, but playful in a way that made it clear he expected admiration more than anything else. There was a confidence in his step, a spark in his eye that suggested he enjoyed the spotlight and perhaps the occasional show of superiority. He began to speak, his voice low but easily audible over the murmur of conversation. He was joking with the small group gathered near the piano, teasing one of the guests about their timid attempts at the keys. "Surely, someone here can actually play something more than a few simple notes," he said, his words playful but carrying a challenge. A few people laughed nervously, unsure if he was serious or merely entertaining himself. He glanced around the room, letting the question hang in the air like a dare. And then his eyes landed on her. She had not been standing out in any way. She was quiet, dressed simply, not attempting to attract attention. But his gaze found her as if drawn by some invisible thread. A smile spread across his face, one that was half teasing, half incredulous. "And what about you?" he called, gesturing toward her. "You look like someone who might surprise me. Can you play the piano?" The question was meant to be lighthearted, a playful challenge to a stranger in the room. But in that moment, all eyes turned toward her, curiosity piqued by the unexpected attention. She felt a slight flutter of nerves, but it was tempered by calm. She didn't need to perform. She had never considered herself a performer. Music was her refuge, not her stage. And yet, something in the way he looked at her, in the way the room seemed to hold its breath, made her realize that she had a choice. She could step forward or step back. She didn't like being the center of attention, but she also knew that stepping away now would satisfy no one, and leave her wondering what might have been. Without saying a word, she moved toward the piano. Each step was quiet but deliberate, measured, as if she were claiming a space she had always belonged in, but had never needed to announce. The murmurs around her grew softer, replaced by the collective anticipation of people sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Some leaned in, curious and amused. Others simply observed, unsure what to expect. The pianist's smile widened, a mix of amusement and challenge, as if he couldn't believe she was actually coming forward. When she reached the piano, She paused for a moment, placing her hands lightly on the polished surface of the keys. There was no dramatic gesture, no flourish, just a simple acknowledgement of the instrument that had been waiting for her touch. The famous pianist leaned closer, his eyebrows raised, silently questioning whether she could meet the challenge he had thrown so casually. The guests around them watched, some exchanging glances, whispering softly to each other. Is she really going to play? The tension was subtle but palpable, like the quiet before a storm, or the moment when a curtain is lifted to reveal something unexpected. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the atmosphere of the room, the weight of expectation, and the soft hum of conversation fading into background noise. Music, she thought, wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about impressing the crowd or meeting someone else's standards. It was about connection, about expression, about letting the notes speak truths that words could never capture. And with that thought, her fingers lifted just above the keys, poised to transform that quiet, ordinary moment into something remarkable. The pianist, noticing the slight tension in her posture, leaned back with a relaxed smile, confident that this would be a brief, polite performance at best. He expected perhaps a few basic notes, a simple melody that would amuse the crowd for a moment before he reclaimed the center of attention. The audience, too, had expectations, conditioned by the world they were used to. Famous musicians on stage, amateurs politely attempting a tune. They did not expect the unexpected. As her fingers descended onto the keys, the first notes were soft, almost hesitant. But even in those first moments, there was a precision, a clarity, and a subtle depth that drew the room's attention. People stopped talking, glasses paused mid-air, and all eyes turned to her. The sound was not loud or showy, but it carried an honesty and beauty that made the air itself seem to pause. The pianist's smirk faltered ever so slightly, replaced by a flicker of surprise. She was not performing to impress. She was playing because the music demanded it, because it lived within her, quietly waiting to be shared. For those who had expected something ordinary, the first notes were a revelation. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the melody began to take shape. It was simple, yes, but it was also alive, resonant, full of emotion and life. There was a grace to her touch, a subtle artistry that could not be faked. And even as the pianist watched, skeptical yet intrigued, he could not deny the quiet power of what she was doing. She had not come to compete. She had come simply to play. And that was enough to capture the attention of every person in the room. The hall, which had been buzzing with polite social chatter, became silent. Not the tense silence of discomfort, but the kind of quiet that arrives when people recognize something extraordinary unfolding before them. Her fingers moved across the keys with a natural confidence, each note falling precisely into place, shaping a melody that felt at once familiar and new. The music was personal, yes, but it was also expansive, reaching into the hearts of everyone listening, drawing them in without demanding anything in return. Even the pianist found himself leaning forward slightly, curiosity replacing his initial amusement. He had performed countless times, dazzled audiences around the world, and yet here was something that caught him off guard. The simplicity of her demeanor, the modesty of her appearance, and the sheer authenticity of her music created a combination he could not have anticipated. The world had taught him to expect spectacle, to anticipate mastery flaunted with flair, but this was different. This was honest. This was real. And so, as the first part of her story unfolded, the room changed. What had started as a gathering of elegance and subtle competition became a space of genuine attention and wonder. People forgot their social masks for a moment. They forgot the hierarchies and the expectations. All that remained was the woman, her piano, and the music that seemed to breathe life into the air. In that moment, she was not just a guest at a fancy event. She was the heart of it, quietly commanding attention with nothing but her talent and authenticity. She sat at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys, taking a quiet, steadying breath. The room was still, every person watching her with curiosity and a growing sense of anticipation. No one spoke. Even the soft clinking of glasses seemed to have paused. She didn't feel pressure, at least not in the way most would have. Instead, there was a calm clarity in her mind, a small inner voice reminding her that music wasn't about approval or recognition. It was about expression, about translating emotions into sound, and right now, all she wanted was to let the piano speak. The famous pianist watched closely, his confidence slowly giving way to curiosity. He had issued the challenge in jest, fully expecting her to decline or produce only a few clumsy notes. He had never anticipated that someone like her, simple in appearance, quiet in manner, would respond with courage and presence. There was something about the way she approached the piano, the gentle focus in her eyes, that unsettled him in a way he didn't fully understand. It was not arrogance he saw, but authenticity. And authenticity, he realized, could be far more powerful than any technique he had mastered over decades. The first few notes came softly, almost as if testing the waters. They were delicate, careful, but each one carried a subtle precision that immediately captured attention. Guests leaned slightly forward, their curiosity turning into intrigue. Some exchanged whispered comments, amazed at the unexpected skill appearing before them. It was not the flashy, dramatic music they had anticipated from a piano performance, but something far more compelling, a melody that spoke with honesty and emotion. It had a warmth that resonated deeply, creating a quiet connection between the pianist, the woman, and the audience. Her hands moved with gentle confidence, fingers dancing across the keys with a grace that seemed effortless. The notes were clear, resonant, carrying subtle nuances that revealed a depth of understanding far beyond casual practice. People who had been expecting a simple, entertaining moment found themselves holding their breath, captivated by the unfolding performance. Even the famous pianist could not help but adjust his posture slightly, his eyes widening as he listened. He was no stranger to talent, but he had never encountered something that felt so immediate, so instinctive. In someone who had seemed so ordinary moments before, the melody began to take shape, shifting through soft, gentle passages and small crescendos that drew the listeners in. There was a fluidity to her playing, a natural ebb and flow that made the music feel alive. She was not performing for applause or recognition. Every note seemed to come from a place deep within her, a personal story expressed through sound, and in that expression, she managed to touch everyone in the room. The atmosphere changed, the small hum of conversation fading completely as guests became fully absorbed in the music. The pianist, who had once seemed unshakable, now watched with a growing sense of admiration. He recognized the subtle skill behind her performance, the control, the timing, the emotional depth, but more than that, he sensed the courage it had taken to play in front of a room full of strangers. It was easy to be talented on a stage where everyone expected brilliance. It was entirely different to do so spontaneously, with no preparation or showmanship. And yet she was doing it with an authenticity that made every note feel vital. Her focus was absolute. She did not glance at the crowd, nor did she seem aware of the famous pianist watching her so intently. Her eyes were closed for brief moments, then opened softly, scanning the keys with careful awareness. Every movement, every touch, was deliberate but fluid, showing a natural command of the instrument that spoke of years of private practice, moments of quiet dedication away from attention and applause. The audience felt the sincerity of her playing, and in response, they gave her their complete attention. As the melody evolved, she began to experiment with subtle variations, adding a gentle complexity that made the music richer without ever feeling forced. The soft swells and diminuendos created tension and release, taking the listeners on an emotional journey. Some leaned forward in their seats, caught by the intimacy of the performance. Others closed their eyes, allowing the sound to wash over them, feeling as though the music was speaking directly to their hearts. The room was no longer a social gathering. It had transformed into a space of shared emotion, held together by the power of her playing. The famous pianist tried to analyze what he was hearing, but logic and technique fell short. It was impossible to quantify what she was doing. Her talent was not flashy or showy, but it was undeniable. Every note carried intention, every phrase seemed to tell a story. He realized that he had underestimated her completely. The challenge he had offered in jest had become something far more significant than he had anticipated. He was witnessing a rare combination of skill, intuition, and courage, all wrapped in the quiet demeanor of someone who could have easily been overlooked. The audience, too, was reacting in ways he hadn't expected. Whispers of astonishment spread quietly among the guests. "She's amazing," someone breathed. "Where did she learn to play like that?" asked another. The more they listened, the more they were drawn into the unfolding moment. People who had been ready to judge or dismiss her were now completely captivated, their attention fully surrendered to the music. Even those who had never paid much attention to piano performances found themselves unable to look away. There was a subtle shift in the energy of the room. The usual barriers of social status, wealth, and reputation seemed to vanish as everyone became focused on the sound coming from the piano. For a few minutes, no one thought about appearances, conversations, or etiquette. Everyone was simply present, experiencing the music and feeling the emotion it conveyed. The transformation was remarkable, not only because of her skill, but because of the way she used that skill to create connection, rather than competition. Her playing continued, each note a gentle invitation to listen, to feel, to experience the music without distraction. The melodies moved from soft, reflective passages to brighter, more lively sections, showcasing her range without ever becoming showy. It was clear that she was in complete control, navigating the piano with a confidence that made every moment feel intentional. Even those who had been skeptical, who had expected something ordinary, now watched with awe. The famous pianist leaned back slightly, momentarily silent. He had been a performer all his life, accustomed to commanding attention and admiration. Yet here was someone doing it effortlessly without any of the usual trappings of fame or showmanship. He felt a strange mix of surprise, admiration, and perhaps even a touch of humility. The simple act of playing the piano had become something profound, a reminder that true talent often appeared in unexpected forms. She was aware of none of this. Fully immersed in the music, her hands moved gracefully, her fingers finding the keys with ease. She experimented with dynamics, allowing the melody to breathe, and every subtle change seemed perfectly natural. It was a performance, yes, but one that carried the intimacy of a private moment shared with anyone willing to listen. The audience could sense this, and their reactions reflected it. Their eyes softened, their breathing slowed, and some even felt a lump form in their throats as they experienced the quiet emotional power of the performance. The first half of her piece was gentle and melodic, inviting the audience to settle into the experience. As she progressed, the music grew more complex, introducing variations and subtle harmonies that highlighted her skill without ever seeming forced. Each phrase seemed to unfold organically, a natural progression of sound that drew the listeners deeper into the story she was telling. The pianist, once so confident, now watched in fascination. He had played for countless audiences, but he had never encountered a moment quite like this. There was a sense of suspense building in the room, though no one was aware of it. Each note, each pause, created a tension that kept everyone leaning forward, waiting for the next sound. She was leading them on an unexpected journey, one that required attention, patience, and openness. And in response, the audience gave everything they had, surrendering fully to the experience. The hall was no longer just a space for socializing. It had become a vessel for emotion, carried by the unassuming woman at the piano. She finished the first major section of her performance with a soft, lingering chord. The note seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. There was a collective intake of breath, as though the audience was reluctant to break the spell. Even the famous pianist, who had issued the challenge with playful confidence, now looked at her with something closer to respect. He could not deny what he had witnessed, her talent, her authenticity, and the courage it took to sit at that piano in front of strangers and play from the heart. For a brief moment, silence reigned. Then, quietly, one person began to clap. Another joined, and then another, until the room filled with applause that was both warm and genuine. It was not the polite clapping one might expect at a formal event, but a spontaneous acknowledgement of something extraordinary. She smiled softly, a small, humble gesture, and nodded slightly in thanks. But she did not bow or perform for attention. The applause was for the music, for the connection she had created, not for herself. The famous pianist rose slowly from his seat, clapping as well, his expression. The applause slowly died down, leaving the room in a comfortable silence. People were still looking toward the piano, as if afraid to break the spell that had settled over them. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the keys, eyes calm but attentive. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet confidence that came not from pride but from the recognition that she had touched the hearts of everyone present. The famous pianist, standing nearby, watched her closely, his earlier amusement replaced with a mixture of curiosity and growing admiration. He had expected a brief performance, a simple display of skill that would amuse the room and then allow him to reclaim the spotlight. Instead, he had been confronted with something extraordinary. There was talent here, yes, but more than that, there was depth, authenticity, and courage. She had faced the attention without hesitation, yet there was no arrogance, no need to dominate the space. She had simply played, allowing the music itself to command the room. And now, as she paused between sections of her performance, the anticipation in the audience was palpable. She took a deep breath, feeling the vibrations of the piano beneath her fingers. She had more to give, more to share, and she felt a quiet determination to continue. The first part of her performance had been gentle, inviting the audience into her world. But now it was time to show them the full breadth of her skill. Her fingers lifted slightly, hovering over the keys. As she prepared to transition into a more complex section, there was no hesitation in her movements, only careful precision and an instinctive understanding of how each note should sound. As she began again, the music changed. The melody grew richer, more intricate, weaving in layers of harmony that added depth and emotion. The soft, gentle notes of the first section gave way to a more dynamic flow, with subtle rises and falls that carried the listener along. Her fingers moved with fluidity, each touch deliberate yet effortless, creating a seamless progression that held the audience in rapt attention. People leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her hands as they danced across the keys, mesmerized by the skill and sensitivity on display. The famous pianist watched with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. He had performed countless times, played for audiences who expected brilliance, and yet he had never encountered anything quite like this. She was not simply playing notes. She was telling a story, creating an emotional journey that unfolded naturally and beautifully. There was an honesty to her music that he found compelling, a way of expressing emotion that transcended technical skill. He realized that the challenge he had issued in jest had become a profound experience, one that left him quietly in awe. The audience, too, was completely captivated. Conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by the sound of the piano and the emotional resonance of the performance. Some people closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried away by the music. Others watched intently, studying the subtle movements of her hands and the expression on her face. There was a collective sense of wonder, a feeling that they were witnessing something rare and precious. Even those who had initially been skeptical or indifferent were now completely absorbed, unable to look away. Her playing continued to evolve, moving seamlessly between gentle passages and more energetic sections. She introduced subtle shifts in tempo, adding a sense of anticipation and surprise without ever losing the flow of the music. Each note seemed to have a purpose, contributing to a larger narrative that unfolded organically. The audience could feel the emotion behind the performance, the quiet moments of reflection, the subtle bursts of joy, the gentle melancholy that lingered beneath the surface. It was a performance that spoke to the heart, not the mind, and it left a lasting impression on everyone who listened. The famous pianist could no longer hide his admiration. He leaned forward slightly, studying her technique and the way she expressed emotion through her playing. He realized that this was not a display of arrogance or a desire to impress. It was a genuine expression of talent and passion. There was a humility in her performance that made it even more powerful, a quiet strength that spoke volumes without the need for words. He felt a sense of respect growing within him, a recognition that true artistry could appear in the most unexpected forms. As the performance progressed, she began to experiment with variations in melody and rhythm, adding subtle flourishes that enriched the music without overwhelming it. Each phrase was carefully crafted, each note placed with intention. The audience could sense the thought and emotion behind every movement, and they responded with quiet, attentive appreciation. There was a sense of shared experience in the room, a connection between the performer and the listeners that transcended social status, background, or expectation. For a few minutes, they were all part of the same world, bound together by the beauty and sincerity of the music. The room seemed to hold its breath as she moved into the most complex section of the piece. The notes flowed rapidly, yet with perfect control, creating a sense of urgency and intensity that contrasted beautifully with the gentler passages that had come before. Her fingers moved with remarkable agility, striking each key with precision and grace. The audience watched in awe, some leaning forward as if they could feel the music more deeply by being closer. The energy in the room shifted, becoming almost tangible, a shared anticipation that heightened the emotional impact of the performance. Even the pianist, who had spent his life mastering the instrument, found himself silently marveling at her skill. He had encountered talented musicians before, of course, but there was something uniquely compelling about her playing. It was not just the technical proficiency, but the way she conveyed emotion through every note, the subtle nuances that brought the music to life. He realized that he had underestimated her completely, assuming that a simple woman with no apparent stage experience could not produce anything remarkable. Now he understood that true talent could be hidden behind the most unassuming appearances, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The audience was completely captivated, caught up in the ebb and flow of the music. Some felt tears welling in their eyes, moved by the sincerity and beauty of the performance. Others felt a sense of wonder, as if they were witnessing something truly rare and extraordinary. There was no polite applause or forced appreciation, only genuine emotional response to the music. People exchanged glances, smiling in quiet recognition of the impact she was having. The room had been transformed from a formal gathering into a shared experience of beauty, connection, and emotion. She continued to play, maintaining perfect control over every aspect of the performance. Her fingers moved effortlessly, navigating complex passages with ease while preserving the emotional integrity of each phrase. She allowed herself moments of improvisation, subtly altering the melody to suit the mood of the room and the response of the audience. It was a delicate balance, one that required both skill and intuition, and she handled it with remarkable poise. The music seemed to flow naturally from her, as if it had always existed within her and simply needed a moment to be expressed. The famous pianist found himself leaning closer, studying her technique and the subtle expressions on her face. He could see the concentration in her eyes, the gentle movement of her hands, the quiet confidence that radiated from her posture. It was a performance unlike any he had witnessed, one that combined technical mastery with deep emotional resonance. He realized that the challenge he had issued in jest had revealed a hidden world of talent, one that defied expectations and left a lasting impression on everyone present. The melody shifted once more, returning to softer, more reflective passages. She allowed the music to breathe, creating space for the audience to absorb the emotional journey she had taken them on. The room was filled with a sense of quiet reverence, as if everyone recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. There was a profound beauty in the simplicity of the moment, a reminder that true artistry did not require grandeur or spectacle. It was enough to play from the heart, to connect with others through the universal language of music. As the performance neared its conclusion, she allowed the final notes to linger, gently fading into silence. The room remained quiet for a moment, as if no one wanted to break the spell that had been created. Then, slowly, applause began to rise. At first, it was tentative, a few hands clapping in recognition of what had just occurred. But soon, it grew louder, more confident, until the entire room was filled with genuine, heartfelt applause. The audience rose to their feet, cheering and clapping. Moved by the unexpected brilliance of her performance, the famous pianist stepped forward, clapping along with the audience. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and surprise, recognizing the courage and talent that had allowed her to create such an extraordinary moment. He had challenged her in jest, expecting a simple display of skill, and instead had been confronted with something remarkable. There was a quiet humility in her demeanor that only added to the impact of the performance. She had not sought recognition or validation, yet she had captured the hearts of everyone in the room. As the applause continued, she lowered her hands from the keys, smiling softly and bowing slightly in acknowledgement. There was no fanfare, no attempt to dominate the room. The room was buzzing with quiet energy, though no one dared speak too loudly. People were still processing what they had just witnessed. The music had ended, but its echo lingered in the minds and hearts of the audience. Some sat in stunned silence, unable to find words to describe what they had heard. Others whispered softly to one another, sharing fragments of awe. "I've never heard anything like that," one person murmured. "She's incredible," said another, almost in disbelief. There was a sense that something extraordinary had occurred, and everyone felt lucky to have been present for it. She remained seated at the piano for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She did not rush to leave, nor did she immediately rise to receive applause. There was a quiet humility in the way she held herself, a sense that she had simply done what felt right, without seeking attention or validation. The audience could sense it, and it made their admiration even deeper. Here was someone who had amazed them without trying to impress, who had shared her talent for the sheer love of music, and it made the moment feel sacred. The famous pianist approached her, a subtle change in his expression. Earlier, he had worn a playful, almost mocking smile, the kind of look that suggested he did not expect to be surprised. Now, that smile was gone, replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. He stopped a few feet away, watching her with careful attention. It was clear he wanted to acknowledge her, to express his recognition of her talent, but he did so without pomp or grand gesture. His approach was thoughtful, respectful, and completely sincere. "You have a remarkable gift," he said, his voice calm but full of admiration. "I did not expect that." His words carried no hint of condescension, only honesty. She nodded quietly, her soft smile acknowledging the compliment. There was no need for a long conversation, no need for dramatics. The music had spoken for her, and it had spoken with more clarity than words ever could. The audience could sense the exchange between them, the quiet acknowledgement of talent meeting respect, and it added a new layer of emotion to the room. People began to move closer, drawn by a mix of curiosity and admiration. They wanted to hear more, to perhaps catch a hint of how she had achieved something so extraordinary. Some asked gentle questions, trying to understand how someone could play with such skill and emotion. "Have you performed before?" one guest asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not in front of an audience like this," she replied softly. "I play mostly for myself." Her words surprised them further. They had assumed that someone with such talent would be accustomed to public performance. But here was a person who had achieved greatness quietly, without seeking recognition. The pianist, standing beside her, nodded in understanding. "It's rare to see someone play with both skill and honesty," he said. "Most performers focus on impressing others. You focus on expressing yourself, and it makes all the difference." She looked at him briefly, meeting his gaze with calm sincerity. There was no arrogance in her eyes, only a quiet pride in her work and a deep connection to the music. The audience sensed this, and their admiration grew. They were not just impressed by her ability, they were inspired by her authenticity, the courage to share her talent without ego or expectation. As people continued to gather round, some began to speak softly to one another, sharing stories of their own experiences with music. Others complimented her directly, their voices full of warmth and appreciation. There was a sense of connection forming in the room, a shared experience that went beyond the performance itself. The music had opened a door, and now everyone felt a part of something larger, something emotional and deeply human. The famous pianist leaned slightly closer to her, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "You have a presence that goes beyond technique," he said. "People are not just hearing the notes, they are feeling them. That is rare. That is real talent." She nodded quietly, taking in his words without overthinking them. It was not a moment of triumph or competition. It was simply a recognition of her gift, a gentle acknowledgement that her music had touched hearts in a way that few performers ever manage. Some guests began to express their amazement more openly, asking if she would consider performing again. Others shared that they had never felt so moved by a live performance. There was an energy in the room now, a mix of awe and inspiration, that had grown from a quiet, unassuming woman at a piano. It was a transformation that no one had anticipated. What had begun as a casual social event had become an unforgettable experience, all because of her talent and sincerity. She allowed herself a small, private moment of satisfaction. Not pride, exactly, but a recognition that she had achieved something meaningful. She had shared a part of herself, and it had resonated with others in a genuine way. The applause and admiration were not what mattered most, it was the connection. The understanding that music could bridge gaps between people and touch emotions that words often fail to reach. The famous pianist, sensing the importance of the moment, stepped slightly back to allow others to interact with her. He knew that his presence, while significant, should not overshadow what had just happened. He watched as people approached her, offering compliments, expressing gratitude, and asking questions. Every reaction was heartfelt, every comment genuine. It was clear that she had made a lasting impression, and he felt both admiration and humility in witnessing it. Some guests asked if she had formal training, curious about how someone could develop such control and expression without public performance experience. She smiled softly, shaking her head. "Mostly I taught myself," she said. "I spend time alone with the piano. I practice, I explore, I let the music guide me." Her words carried a quiet wisdom, a reminder that talent is not always nurtured in grand institutions or on big stages. It can grow in quiet spaces, nurtured by curiosity and passion. The pianist nodded, impressed by her humility and focus. "Talent like yours is rare," he said, "and it's even rarer to see it shared with such honesty." He paused, then added, "You have reminded me why I play. It's not about applause or recognition, it's about connection, about touching lives." "You've done that tonight," she smiled, acknowledging his words with a soft nod. There was no need for more. The exchange itself felt significant, a quiet validation of the journey she had taken with music and the courage it had taken to share it. The audience continued to discuss the performance in hushed tones, expressing astonishment and admiration. Some were visibly moved, their eyes glistening with emotion. Others were inspired, realizing that talent can emerge from the most unexpected places. There was a collective understanding that what they had witnessed was rare and meaningful. The simple act of sharing music had transformed the atmosphere, creating a sense of wonder and connection that lingered even as the initial excitement began to settle. She remained calm, accepting the attention without seeking it. There was no need to boast or perform again. Her presence at the piano, the music she had shared, and the authenticity she had conveyed were enough. People respected her for that, and the famous pianist recognized it too. He could see that her influence extended beyond technical skill. It was her character, her humility, and her emotional presence that had left the audience captivated. Gradually, the room began to return to its usual rhythm, but the energy had changed. Conversations resumed, but now there was a sense of genuine warmth and admiration that hadn't been present before. People were inspired, reflective, and eager to share the experience they had just had. The woman at the piano had created something lasting, a moment that transcended the formalities of the event and left a deep impression on everyone present. The famous pianist finally spoke to the crowd, his voice carrying a newfound respect. "Tonight, we have witnessed something extraordinary," he said. "Talent can appear in the most unexpected forms. We should never underestimate the quiet, the humble, or the unassuming. True artistry comes from passion and authenticity, and tonight, we have been reminded of that." His words drew nods and murmurs of agreement. People looked back at her, their admiration evident in their eyes. She simply smiled, acknowledging the sentiment without fanfare. As the evening continued, some guests approached her to express their personal appreciation. Stories were shared, compliments given, and moments of connection formed. People were drawn to her presence, inspired not only by her musical talent, but by her demeanor, her humility, and her courage. Even those who had initially doubted her now recognized that they had underestimated her completely. It was a powerful reminder that appearances can be misleading, and that greatness often lies hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The famous pianist stayed close, observing the interactions and occasionally joining the conversation. He was no longer the center of attention, nor did he need to be. He had recognized her brilliance, acknowledged it, and now allowed the audience to experience it fully. There was a sense of camaraderie, respect, and admiration that had grown organically from the performance, and it was clear that the impact would remain long after the evening ended. By the time the event began to wind down, her presence had left a lasting impression on everyone. The music, the authenticity, and the quiet power of her performance had transformed the atmosphere. People left with a sense of wonder, inspired to recount. The evening was coming to an end, but the impact of her performance lingered in every corner of the hall. The soft hum of conversation carried the excitement and admiration of the guests, who had experienced something truly remarkable. People were still talking about the way she had played, how the music had seemed to reach into their hearts, and how someone so quiet and unassuming could command such attention without even trying. The event had started as a formal gathering, but it had ended as something far more meaningful, a shared moment of inspiration and awe. She remained near the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, not quite ready to leave. There was a quiet satisfaction in her posture, a calm awareness that she had shared something important. It wasn't about applause or recognition. She had simply allowed herself to be present with the music, and the response had been overwhelming in the most genuine way. Guests occasionally approached her, expressing admiration in whispers or gentle smiles, and each interaction left a subtle warmth in her heart. She had never imagined that one evening could carry such significance. The famous pianist stayed nearby. His demeanor changed from the playful, confident man who had challenged her earlier. Now, he seemed thoughtful, reflective, and fully present in the moment. He watched as people continued to gather around her, listening to her speak softly about her approach to music, and he realized that her influence extended far beyond her skill on the piano. It was her humility, her authenticity, and the quiet strength she exhibited that had left the deepest impression. He had spent a lifetime performing on grand stages, but he had rarely seen such an immediate and profound connection with an audience. Some guests, still in awe, asked if she would consider performing again, perhaps in a more formal setting. She smiled softly, shaking her head. "I play for the music, not for an audience," she said. Her words carried honesty, and the sincerity in her tone made the audience nod in understanding. They had already experienced something rare and special, something that could not be recreated simply by repeating a performance. They had been present at the moment it had happened, and that memory would remain with them forever. The pianist approached her again, this time with a more personal acknowledgement. "What you did tonight," he said quietly, "is a reminder of why music matters. It's not the fame or recognition that makes it powerful, it's the ability to connect, to reach people's hearts. You've done that in a way I've rarely seen. She nodded, listening without the need for any elaborate response. It was a simple, human exchange, a recognition of talent and courage that needed no embellishment. The audience, watching from a respectful distance, felt the weight of the moment. They had seen a genuine artist, one who had let the music speak before any words were spoken. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Where there had been polite socializing and subtle competition, there was now quiet reflection and admiration. People were discussing not only the performance, but the courage it took to play with such authenticity in front of strangers. Some were inspired, realizing that talent can emerge from the most unexpected places, often when humility and passion intersect. Others were simply moved, touched by the emotional depth of the music and the human presence behind it. It was a moment that transcended social status, background, and expectation. She allowed herself to step away from the piano briefly, letting the audience approach her with personal compliments. Each interaction was gentle and genuine, and she responded with modesty, acknowledging their praise without making it about herself. Her demeanor left a lasting impression, demonstrating that true talent is not about self-promotion, but about sharing one's gift sincerely. People were captivated not just by her skill, but by her humanity, the combination of talent and character that made her unforgettable. The famous pianist watched as the crowd continued to interact with her, realizing that the night had become about more than music. It had become a reminder of what art can do when approached with sincerity and humility. The performance had opened hearts, inspired conversation, and reminded everyone present that greatness can appear in the most unlikely forms. He felt a quiet admiration, recognizing that she had taught him and everyone else in the room a lesson in humility and authenticity. Some of the guests expressed surprise at her approach to music. Most people would perform again, seeking applause. One person said quietly, "But she just plays. It's like the music is more important than the audience." Others nodded, understanding the profound truth in the observation. It was clear that her relationship with the piano was deeply personal, not for show or recognition. The fact that she could inspire and move others, while remaining humble, added to the magic of the evening. The pianist leaned closer to her once more, his voice soft. "You've reminded me what it means to truly play, not just perform. People often forget that music is about connection, about honesty. Tonight, you've done both." She smiled, a gentle acknowledgement of his words. It was a quiet moment, almost invisible to the rest of the room, but it carried weight. It was the recognition of a shared understanding, a mutual respect born from the power of music and the courage to express oneself fully. Guests began to move toward the exits as the evening drew to a close, but the memory of the performance lingered. Conversations were filled with admiration and reflection. People described the way her music had made them feel, the unexpected emotions it had stirred, and the lesson in humility and authenticity it had offered. Even as they left the hall, they carried with them a sense of wonder and inspiration that would last long after the night ended. She took a final glance at the piano, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The experience had been meaningful not because of applause or recognition, but because she had shared a part of herself in a way that resonated with others. It was a reminder that true talent and courage do not always need validation. Sometimes, the act of sharing is enough. Her music had created a connection, and that connection was the real reward. The famous pianist lingered a moment longer, watching her quietly pack up her things and preparing to leave. He had come expecting a playful, light-hearted moment, perhaps a bit of entertainment. Instead, he had been confronted with extraordinary talent, authenticity, and humility. The experience had humbled him, inspired him, and reminded him why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. He knew that this encounter would stay with him, shaping his understanding of artistry for years to come. As she stepped toward the exit, guests continued to express their appreciation in small, heartfelt ways. Some shook her hand, others offered quiet compliments, and a few even shared personal stories of how the music had moved them. She responded with simple gestures, nods, and soft smiles, never drawing attention to herself but acknowledging the impact she had made. There was a warmth in the room, a lingering sense of connection, as though her presence had transformed the evening in ways that words could not fully capture. Outside the hall, the cool night air carried a sense of calm and reflection. She walked slowly, allowing herself to absorb the quiet after the intensity of the performance. There was a sense of fulfillment that went beyond pride. It was a deep satisfaction that comes from sharing something meaningful, from touching others in a way that leaves a lasting impression. The applause, admiration, and acknowledgement were secondary to the connection she had created, a reminder that true artistry is always about more than recognition. The famous pianist lingered at the doorway, watching her disappear into the night. He knew that he had witnessed something rare, something that would stay with him for a lifetime. Her performance had reminded him and everyone present of the power of authenticity, the courage to share one's gift, and the simple, profound beauty of music played with sincerity. It was a moment of learning, inspiration, and humility that transcended the boundaries of talent, fame, and expectation. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of the performance spread quietly but steadily. Guests shared their experience with friends, colleagues, and family, recounting not only the extraordinary skill, but also the humility, authenticity, and emotional resonance of her playing. The tale became a source of inspiration, a reminder that talent can appear unexpectedly, and that true greatness is measured not only by skill, but by character, courage, and the ability to touch hearts. She returned to her daily life with the same quiet demeanor she had always had. The performance had not changed her ambitions or desires. It had simply affirmed the value of sharing what she loved. Music remained her refuge, her joy, and her way of connecting with the world. The acknowledgement and admiration she had received were meaningful, but they were not the driving force. What mattered most was the impact her music had on others, the invisible threads of emotion and connection she had created in that hall. The famous pianist, reflecting on the experience, found himself thinking differently about performance, recognition, and talent. He realized that the most profound artistry often comes from those who do not seek attention, who play for the love of their craft rather than for applause. Her performance had reminded him that humility and authenticity are as powerful as skill and technique, and that true greatness often emerges quietly, without fanfare or expectation. In the end, the story of that evening